The Woman with 12 Children, a mystery from Margaret Chen, a professional estate appraiser, carefully navigated through towers of forgotten furniture and cobweb-draped trunks, her flashlight cutting through the dim afternoon light that filtered through grimy windows. It was supposed to be a routine evaluation. The elderly Mrs. Whitmore had passed away, leaving behind a Victorian mansion filled with antiques and memories. Margaret had seen countless such homes, each telling its own story through accumulated possessions. But nothing had prepared her for what she would find tucked away in a leather portfolio beneath a stack of yellowed newspapers. The photograph was unlike anything she had encountered in her 15 years of estate work. Measuring roughly 8 by 10 inches, it showed a woman seated in what appeared to be a photographer's studio, surrounded by 12 children of varying ages. The woman's face was the most striking feature. She wore an enigmatic smile that seemed to hold secrets, her eyes gazing directly at the camera with an intensity that made Margaret feel as though she were being watched across the decades. The children, ranging from what appeared to be toddlers to teenagers, were arranged around her in a careful composition. Each child's face told a different story. Some smiled innocently, others looked serious beyond their years, and a few seemed to carry a weight that children shouldn't bear. Their clothing suggested the photograph was taken sometime in the early 1900s, and a faded stamp on the back confirmed Margaret's suspicion. Hartwell Photography Studio, Boston. What made the photograph truly extraordinary wasn't just its age or the unusual number of children, but something indefinable about the woman's expression. Her smile wasn't the typical formal pose of early 20th century photography. Instead, it held a mysterious quality, part maternal warmth, part knowing secret, and something else that Margaret couldn't quite identify. Margaret carefully lifted the photograph, noting its remarkable presence. Beneath it lay a collection of documents, birth certificates, adoption papers, and what appeared to be correspondence between various institutions. As she began to examine these papers, a chill ran down her spine. The dates didn't match. The birth certificates showed impossible timelines, and the adoption papers referenced children who, according to other documents, had died years before the photograph was taken. The woman in the photograph was identified in one document as Miss Eleanor Hartwell, but other papers referred to her as Miss Catherine Morrison and Mrs. Sarah Blackwood. 3 different names, 3 different identities, yet the handwriting appeared to be from the same person. Margaret sat back on her heels, the photograph trembling slightly in her hands. She had stumbled upon something far more complex than a simple family portrait. This wasn't just a photograph, it was evidence of a mystery that had been hidden for over a century. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the attic floor. Margaret carefully gathered the photograph and document, her mind racing with questions. Who was this woman really? Were these truly her children, or was something more sinister at play? And why had someone gone to such lengths to hide this collection away? As she prepared to leave the attic, Margaret noticed something else, a small notation in pencil on the back of the photograph, so faint she had almost missed it. The truth lies in the eyes of the innocent. Below that, in different handwriting, may God forgive us all. Discover more mysterious historical photographs and the secrets they hold. Click here to explore our collection of unsolved photographic mysteries from the past century. Margaret's apartment that evening felt different somehow, as if the mysterious photograph had brought with it an atmosphere of secrets and whispered histories. She had spread the documents across her dining table, creating a timeline that made less sense the more she studied it. The birth certificates told an impossible story. According to the dates, Eleanor Hartwell had given birth to 12 children over a span of just 4 years, a biological impossibility. Some of the certificates showed births occurring simultaneously in different states, while others bore the signatures of doctors who, according to Margaret's preliminary research, had died before the supposed birth dates. Margaret had always prided herself on her methodical approach to research. Her background in early history combined with her experience in estate appraisal, had taught her to look beyond the obvious and question inconsistencies. But this case challenged everything she thought she knew about documentary evidence. She opened her laptop and began searching for information about the Hartwell Photography Studio. What she found was both illuminating and disturbing. The studio had operated in Boston from 1910 to 1920, specializing in family portraits and what were euphemistically called memorial photographs. Images of deceased family members, often children, posed as if they were merely sleeping. The practice wasn't uncommon in the early 1900s, when infant mortality rates were high and photography was expensive. Families often commissioned these portraits as their only visual memory of lost loved ones. But something about the Hartwell studio set it apart from others of its era. Margaret found a newspaper article from 1916 buried in the archives of the Boston Herald, local photography studio under investigation, following disturbing allegations. The article was frustratingly brief, mentioning only that authorities were looking into irregularities in business practices and concerns raised by several prominent families. The investigation seemed to have disappeared as quickly as it had begun. No follow-up articles appeared, and the studio continued operating until 1920, when it closed abruptly. The building that had housed the studio was demolished in 1925, and all records seemed to have vanished with it. Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying the photograph once more. The woman's smile seemed different now, less mysterious, more knowing. It was as if she were aware of secrets that would remain hidden long after the camera's shutter clicked. The children's faces drew Margaret's attention again. Now that she knew about the studio's connection to memorial photography, she began to notice details she had missed before. Some of the children had an almost ethereal quality to their appearance, their skin too pale, their poses too still. Others seemed to be plenty alive, their eyes bright with curiosity and mischief. Margaret counted the children again, more carefully this time. 12, as she had originally thought, but arranged in a specific pattern. The older children stood behind the woman, while the younger ones sat at her feet or on her lap. But there was something about their positioning that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. She pulled out a magnifying glass and examined each face more closely. That's when she noticed it. Several of the children bore a striking resemblance to missing persons cases she had read about in her research into early 20th century Boston. The facial features, the clothing, even the estimated ages seemed to match descriptions from newspaper reports of children who had disappeared between 1900 and 1918. Margaret's hands began to shake as the implications sank. Was she looking at evidence of something far more sinister than unusual adoption practices? Had she stumbled upon proof of crimes that had gone unsolved for over a century? The woman's smile now seemed less enigmatic and more chilling. Margaret found herself wondering if those eyes held not maternal love, but the satisfaction of someone who had gotten away with the unthinkable. As midnight approached, Margaret carefully placed the photograph and documents in a secure folder. Tomorrow, she would need to contact someone with more expertise in historical criminal investigations. But tonight, she couldn't shake the feeling that 12 pairs of young eyes were watching her from across the decades, waiting for someone to finally tell their story. Though Chemis Harrison had seen his share of cold cases during his 30-year career as a forensic historian, but the materials Margaret Chen brought to his office at Boston University challenged even his experienced perspective. The professor's cluttered office, lined with books on criminal history and forensic science, seemed a perfect setting for unraveling a century-old mystery. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Harrison murmured, adjusting his reading glasses as he examined the photograph under a specialized lamp. "The quality of preservation is remarkable, but more importantly, the composition tells a story that goes beyond a simple family portrait." Margaret watched as the professor's trained eye moved systematically across the image. She had spent a sleepless night researching missing children cases from 1915, and what she had discovered had only deepened the mystery. He found newspaper reports of at least 6 children who disappeared in the Boston area between 1912 and 1915. Margaret explained, spreading photocopied articles across the professor's desk. The physical descriptions match several of the children in this photograph with unsettling accuracy. Dr. Harrison nodded grimly. The early 1900s were a different time. Record-keeping was inconsistent. Law enforcement resources were limited, and society's understanding of criminal psychology was primitive. It wasn't uncommon for cases to simply disappear from public attention. He pointed to specific children in the photograph. Notice the positioning and body language. These 3 children here, he indicated the ones standing furthest from the woman, show signs of distress. Their postures suggest fear or discomfort. But these others, he moved his finger to the children closest to the woman, appear more relaxed, almost protective of her. Margaret leaned closer. What does that suggest? Possibly that not all of these children arrived at the same time or under the same circumstances. Some may have been with her longer, developing a form of Stockholm Syndrome, or simply adapting to their situation. Others might have been more recent acquisitions. The professor pulled out a file from his desk drawer. I've been researching similar cases from this era. There were several documented instances of individuals who operated what we might now call child trafficking rings, though they often disguised their activities as orphanages or adoption services. Margaret felt a chill as Dr. Harrison continued. The lack of proper oversight and the desperation of families during economic hardship created opportunities for exploitation. Some operators would collect children through various means, purchasing them from destitute families, taking in supposed orphans, or simply taking children who wouldn't be immediately missed. But why photograph them all together? Margaret asked. Wouldn't that create evidence? Though Harrison's expression darkened. That's what makes this case particularly disturbing. The photograph suggests a level of confidence, almost pride, in what she was doing. It's possible this woman saw Fairship not as a criminal, but as someone providing a service, or perhaps she was documenting her collection for other purposes. The professor moved to his computer and pulled up a database of historical records. I've been cross-referencing the names you found with immigration records, death certificates, and institutional records from the period. The results are troubling. The screens showed a complex web of connection. Eleanor Hartwell, Catherine Morrison, and Sarah Blackwood had all operated in different capacities throughout New England. Between Hartwell ran the photography studio. Morrison was listed as the director of a private children's home that had no official records, and Blackwood appeared on ship manifests as someone who frequently traveled to Europe with groups of children. It appears we're dealing with an organized operation, Dr. Harrison explained. The photography studio may have been used to document the children for potential buyers or to create false family records. The multiple identities suggest a sophisticated understanding of how to avoid detection. Margaret studied the timeline the professor had created. What happened to them all? The children, the woman, the entire operation. That's where the trail goes cold, Dr. Harrison admitted. In 1920, all 3 identities disappeared from official record simultaneously. The photography studio closed. The children's home was reported as relocated, and there are no further ship manifests for Sarah Blackwood. The professor returned to the photograph, studying the woman's face with renewed intensity. But this smile, there's something about it that suggests she knew this day would come. Almost as if she were leaving a message for someone to find. Uncover more hidden histories and unsolved mysteries from the past. Join our community of historical investigators and help solve cases that have puzzled experts for decades. The basement archives of the Boston Public Library held records that hadn't seen daylight in decades. Margaret and Harrison had spent 3 days navigating bureaucratic red tape to gain access to the restricted historical documents, and their persistence was finally paying off. Here, Dr. Harrison whispered, his voice echoing in the climate-controlled storage room. He pulled a thick folder from a filing cabinet. Mark, Municipal Record. Eleanor Hartwell hadn't been working alone. She was part of a network that extended far beyond Boston, reaching into the highest levels of society. Margaret carefully photographed each document with her phone, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were uncovering. The papers included correspondence between Hartwell and several prominent Boston families, detailing arrangements for special adoptions and discreet placements. Look at this. Margaret pointed to a letter dated March. Hartwell is discussing the preparation of children for overseas placement. She mentions specific requirements, age, appearance, temperament, as if she were filling orders. Dr. Harrison's face had grown pale as he read through the documents. This suggests an international trafficking operation. Children were being taken from the Boston area and shipped to buyers in Europe, possibly to wealthy families who couldn't have children of their own, or worse. The most disturbing document was a ledger that appeared to track individual children by number rather than name. Each entry included physical descriptions, acquisition dates, and what appeared to be sale prices. The amounts were substantial, enough to suggest that this was a highly profitable enterprise. Number 47. Margaret read aloud. Female, age approximately 8, brown hair, blue eyes, acquired March 1915, prepared for European placement, price 5. That would be equivalent to over $12. The professor nodded grimly. And look at the frequency of entries. New children were being processed almost weekly during the peak period of 1914 to 1915. Margaret counted the entries in the ledger. There are over 200 children listed here, but we only see 12 in the photograph. The photograph might represent a specific group, Dr. Harrison suggested. Perhaps children who were being prepared for a particular buyer, or those who were part of a special arrangement. As they continued reading, a pattern emerged. The operation had been sophisticated and well-connected. Letters referenced dads who expedited adoption papers, ship captains who asked no questions about passenger manifests, and even government officials who provided documentation for children with no legal existence. Margaret found a letter that made her blood run cold. Dated April 3, 1915. It was addressed to my dear European associates and signed by Eleanor Hartwell. The letter discussed the successful completion of the spring collection and promised that the 12 special children you requested are now ready for transport. The timing matches, Harrison observed. The photograph was taken in 1915. According to the studio stamp, this letter suggests that those 12 children were destined for Europe. But the most shocking discovery came in the form of a newspaper clipping tucked between the pages of the ledger. The headline read, "Tragic fire claims lives of 12 children at local orphanage." The article, dated May 15, 1915, described how a fire had destroyed a private children's home run by a Miss Catherine Morrison, killing all 12 residents. Margaret stared at the clipping, her mind racing. The same 12 children from the photograph. Dr. Harrison examined the article closely. It's possible, if the trafficking operation was discovered or threatened, staging the deaths of the children would eliminate evidence and provide a cover story for their disappearance. The article mentioned that the bodies were too badly burned for identification, and that Miss Morrison had perished trying to save the children, but there was no mention of Eleanor Hartwell or the photography studio. He created her own death, Margaret realized. Catherine Morrison deals in the fire. Eleanor Hartwell closes the studio and disappears, and Sarah Blackwood stops appearing on ship, manifests. She erased all her identities and vanished. Dr. Harrison pulled out his phone and began making calls to colleagues in Europe. If those children were shipped overseas before the fire, there might be records on the other end. Immigration documents, adoption papers, something that could tell us what really happened to them. As they prepared to leave the archives, Margaret took one last look at the photograph on her phone. The woman's smile now seemed less mysterious and more sinister, the satisfied expression of someone who had orchestrated the perfect crime. But something nagged at Margaret. If Eleanor Hartwell had been so careful to erase all evidence of her operation, why had this photograph and these documents survived? Why had they been preserved in the Whitmore estate? The answer, she suspected, lay in the final piece of the puzzle, discovering the connection between the Whitmore family and the woman with 12 children. The revelation came not from dusty archives or forgotten documents, but from an unexpected source. Miss Whitmore's elderly neighbor, who had been watching Margaret's frequent visits to the estate with growing curiosity. "You're the appraiser, aren't you?" Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman asked, approaching Margaret as she locked up the Whitmore house after another day of research. The 87-year-old woman moved slowly but with purpose, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Yes, I am," Margaret replied, something in the woman's manner suggesting this wasn't a casual conversation. "I've been wondering when someone would finally find Eleanor's things," Miss Kellerman said quietly. "I've been waiting 70 years for this day." Margaret's heart began to race. "Eleanor? You mean Eleanor Hartwell?" Mrs. Kellerman nodded slowly. "Eleanor Whitmore, she became. Though that wasn't her real name either, was it? Come inside, dear. It's time." Someone knew the truth. Mrs. Kellerman's living room was a shrine to decades of careful observation. Photo albums lined the shelves, and newspaper clippings were organized in neat folders. But what drew Margaret's attention was a framed photograph on the mantelpiece, a young woman who bore an unmistakable resemblance to the mysterious woman from "That's my Aunt Eleanor," Mrs. Kellerman explained, settling into her favorite chair. "Though I didn't learn the truth about her until I was much older. My family spent decades keeping her secrets." Margaret sat on the edge of the sofa, hardly daring to breathe. "What secrets?" Mrs. Kellerman's eyes grew distant. "Eleanor came to live with the Whitmore family. She was my uncle's second wife, though the marriage was more of a business arrangement than a love match. She needed a new identity, and he needed someone to help care for his aging mother." The elderly woman pulled out a photo album and opened it to a page marked with a ribbon. But Eleanor wasn't the woman she pretended to be. She was haunted by something terrible from her past. She would wake up screaming in the night, calling out names, children's names. Margaret leaned forward. "Did she ever tell anyone what happened?" "Not directly. But over the years, pieces of the story came out. She had been involved in something involving children, something that had gone terribly wrong. She spoke of a fire, of children who had died because of her actions." Miss Kellerman turned the page, revealing more photographs of Eleanor Whitmore through the decades. In each image, the woman looked older, more worn, but that enigmatic smile was notably absent. These were the faces of someone carrying an enormous burden of guilt. "She never had children of her own after coming here," Mrs. Kellerman continued. "Said she didn't deserve them, but she did something else. She spent the rest of her life trying to make amends." The elderly woman walked to a desk and pulled out a thick folder. "Eleanor kept meticulous records of every penny she donated to orphanages, children's hospitals, and missing children organizations. From 1920 until her death in 1965, she gave away nearly everything she had." Margaret examined the donation records. The amounts were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars over 45 years, all directed to war organizations that help children. "But that's not all," Mrs. Kellerman said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "She also kept searching for them, the children from her past. She hired private investigators, contacted adoption agencies across Europe, spent fortunes trying to find out what had happened to the children she had lost." Margaret felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "Did she ever find any of them?" Mrs. Kellerman nodded slowly. 3 of them. They had been adopted by families in England and France. Eleanor tracked them down in the 1930s, and she never contacted them directly, but she arranged for anonymous financial support throughout their lives, education funds, medical expenses, even help with their own children. The elderly woman pulled out another folder, this one containing correspondence with European lawyers and investigators. She found out that most of the children had been placed with legitimate families who believed they were adopting war orphans. The buyers thought they were performing acts of charity. What about the others? Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answers. Mrs. Kellerman's expression grew even more somber. Some were never found. Others didn't survive the journey to Europe. Eleanor discovered that several children had died during transport or shortly after arrival. The conditions were apparently terrible. Margaret thought about the photograph, about the woman's smile and the children's faces. Why did she keep the photograph and documents? Why not destroy them? Because she couldn't forget, Mrs. Kellerman replied. She said the children's faces haunted her dreams, and she needed to remember them. The photograph was her penance, a daily reminder of what she had done. The elderly woman walked to the window, looking out at the Whitmore estate. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would make sure the truth came out someday. She wanted the world to know what had happened to those children, even if it meant destroying her reputation. Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Why didn't you come forward before now? Because I was young and scared, and because some of those children were still alive. Eleanor made me promise to wait until they had all passed away naturally. The last one died 3 years ago. A woman in France who had lived a good life, never knowing the truth about her origins. Help us preserve and share important historical stories like this one. Support our mission to uncover hidden truths and give voice to those who have been forgotten by history. The European connection proved to be the key that unlocked the final chapter of Eleanor Harwell's story. Harrison's contacts in London and Paris had uncovered immigration records that painted a picture both more complex and more tragic than anyone had imagined. Margaret sat in Dr. Harrison's office, surrounded by documents that had arrived via secure courier from archives across Europe. The story they told was one of desperation, war, and unintended consequences that had spiraled far beyond anyone's control. It wasn't what we thought, Dr. Harrison said, his voice heavy with the weight of discovery. Eleanor Harwell wasn't running a simple trafficking operation. She was part of an underground network trying to save children from a much worse fate. The documents revealed that Eleanor had been working with a group of social reformers who were attempting to rescue children from abusive situations, overcrowded orphanages, and families that were selling them into industrial labor. The operation had begun with noble intentions, but had gradually become corrupted by the enormous sums of money involved. Look at this correspondence, Margaret said, pointing to a letter dated February. Eleanor is writing to someone in London about emergency placements for children who are in immediate danger. She mentions that local authorities are either unable or unwilling to help. Dr. Harrison nodded. The early 1900s were a brutal time for poor children. Child labor was common, abuse was rarely prosecuted, and many children simply disappeared into the industrial system with no one to advocate for them. The European records showed that most of the children who had been sent overseas had indeed been placed with wealthy families who genuinely wanted to adopt. The high prices weren't immense for the children themselves, but covered the enormous costs of documentation, transportation, and bribes necessary to move children across international borders without official approval. But something went wrong, Margaret observed, reading through a series of increasingly frantic letters from Eleanor to her European contacts. By early 1915, she was losing control of the operation. The letters revealed that other individuals had infiltrated the network, people who were more interested in profit than in child welfare. Children were being taken from families who hadn't consented to give them up, and some were being sold to buyers whose intentions were far from charitable. This letter from Marx 1915 is particularly telling, Dr. Harrison said. Eleanor is writing to someone named Gaudium, expressing her horror at discovering that some children have been sold to industrial concerns rather than families. She's threatening to expose the entire operation. Margaret found the response letter, dated just days later. Todos Tomorrow's threatening, warning Eleanor that she was too deeply involved to walk away clean, and that certain authorities had been informed of her activities. She was trapped. Margaret realized she had started with good intentions, but by Nientendo Heinze, she was caught between criminal partners and law enforcement. The photograph might have been taken as insurance, evidence of what she was really trying to do. The most heartbreaking discovery came in the form of Eleanor's personal journal, which had been preserved in a safety deposit box in London. The entries from April and May 1915 revealed a woman in complete despair. April does have become the very thing I sought to fight against. These children trusted me to protect them, and instead I have delivered them into uncertainty. God forgive me, I do not know how many I have saved, versus how many I have doomed. May 10, 1915. The authorities are closing in, and my partners grow more dangerous by the day. I have made arrangements for the 12 children currently in my care. They will be safe, but I fear I cannot save myself. If something happens to me, I pray someone will someday tell their story. Dr. Harrison looked up from the journal. The fire wasn't staged to cover up trafficking. It was real. Eleanor's partners had decided she was a liability and attempted to eliminate both her and the evidence. But Eleanor had anticipated that. Margaret found the final piece of the puzzle in a letter Eleanor had written to a trusted contact in Boston, dated May. In it she detailed her plan to fake the deaths of the 12 children, while secretly moving them to safety with families she had personally vetted. She saved them, Margaret whispered. The children in the photograph, she got them out before the fire. The European records confirmed this. All 12 children had arrived safely in England and France, where they were placed with families who had been carefully selected by Eleanor's legitimate contacts. The adoption papers were genuine, and the families had been told the truth, that these were children rescued from dangerous situations in America. But Eleanor herself? Margaret asked. Dr. Harrison's expression was grim. She barely escaped the fire. The journal entry says, "Stop abruptly on May 15th. Margaret thought about the woman who had become Eleanor Whitmore, spending 45 years trying to atone for her perceived sins. She never knew, did she? She never found out that all 12 children had survived and lived good lives. Apparently not, Dr. Harrison confirmed. The records show that she spent decades searching for them, but the families had been instructed to keep the children's origin secret for their own protection. Eleanor died believing she had failed them. As Margaret looked at the photograph, one final time, the woman's smile took on a completely different meaning. It wasn't the satisfied expression of a criminal or the mysterious look of someone hiding dark secrets. It was the brave smile of a woman trying to reassure 12 frightened children that everything would be all right, even as her own world was collapsing around her. The children's faces, too, seemed different now. The fear Margaret had initially interpreted as evidence of abuse was actually the natural anxiety of children who had been through trauma, but were finally safe. The protective position in around Eleanor wasn't the result of Stockholm Syndrome. It was genuine affection for someone who had risked everything to save them. 6 months after the discovery in the Whitmore attic, Margaret stood before a packed auditorium at the Boston Historical Society, preparing to share the true story of Eleanor Hartwell and the 12 children. The photograph, now professionally restored and enlarged, hung behind her as she addressed an audience that included historians, genealogists, and descendants of some of the children themselves. The investigation had taken on a life of its own. Harrison's contacts in Europe had helped locate family members of several of the children, and their stories had added crucial details to the historical record. What emerged was a tale of remarkable courage and sacrifice that had been hidden for over a century. Eleanor Hartwell was not the villain that initial evidence suggested. Margaret told the audience She was a woman who found herself caught between her desire to help vulnerable children and the harsh realities of a world that offered few legal options for such rescue operations. The European families had preserved letters and documents that painted a picture of the children's lives after their rescue. All 12 had been given loving homes, received educations, and gone on to live full lives. Several had become teachers, doctors, and social workers, perhaps inspired by their early experiences to help others in need. Margaret clicked to the next slide, showing a photograph from It showed an elderly woman surrounded by children at a Boston orphanage she had supported for decades. The smile was different from the one in the 1915 photograph, sadder perhaps, but also more peaceful. Mrs. Whitmore never knew that her efforts in 1915 had been successful. Margaret continued. She spent 50 years believing she had failed the children she had tried to save, never realizing that all 12 had survived and thrived. Dr. Harrison, seated in the front row, had helped Margaret piece together the final elements of the story. They had discovered that Eleanor's network had actually saved over 300 children between 1912 and 1915, placing them with families across Europe and America. The operation had only turned dangerous when criminal elements had attempted to take control. The most moving discovery had come from the descendants themselves. Margaret clicked to a slide, showing a letter written in 1987 by one of the 12 children, now an elderly woman living in England. "I have always wondered about the kind lady who brought me to my family," the letter read. "My parents told me that a brave woman in America had saved me from a terrible situation, but they never knew her name. I have spent my life trying to find her, to thank her for giving me the chance at happiness. If she is still alive, I want her to know that her sacrifice was not in vain." Margaret's voice caught slightly as she read the letter. This woman, Sarah Mitchell, spent decades searching for Eleanor, just as Eleanor had spent decades searching for her. They never found each other, but their stories are now forever connected. The audience was silent as Margaret concluded her presentation. The photograph that started this investigation was never meant to be mysterious. It was simply a record of a moment when 12 vulnerable children were finally safe, taken by a woman who wanted to remember their faces before she sent them to new lives, far from danger. After the presentation, Margaret was approached by an elderly man who had been sitting quietly in the back of the auditorium. He introduced himself as Thomas Mitchell, the grandson of one of the 12 children. "My grandmother was Sarah Mitchell," he said, his voice emotional. "She died in 2010, still wondering about the woman who had saved her. I want to thank you for finally giving us her name." Thomas pulled out a small photograph from his wallet. It showed a young girl with bright eyes and a hopeful smile, the same face that Margaret had studied so carefully in the 1915 photograph. Grandmother always said she remembered being photographed with other children before she went to a new family. Thomas continued. "She said the lady who arranged everything had the keenest eyes she had ever seen, and that she wasn't afraid anymore after meeting her." Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Your reindeer was right. Eleanor Hartwell did have kind eyes, and she would have been so happy to know that Sarah lived a good life." As the evening wound down, Margaret found herself standing alone with the enlarged photograph. The mystery that had consumed her for months was finally solved, but she realized that the real discovery wasn't about solving a crime or uncovering a scandal. It was about recognizing the courage of a woman who had risked everything to protect children, and the resilience of 12 young lives that had been given a second chance. Dr. Harrison joined her, carrying a folder of documents that would soon be donated to the Historical Society's. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "this case has changed how I think about historical mysteries. Sometimes the truth is more beautiful than the mystery itself." Margaret nodded, taking one last look at Eleanor Hartwell's smile. It no longer seemed enigmatic or mysterious. It was simply the expression of a woman who had done what she believed was right, regardless of the personal cost. "The children knew," Margaret said quietly. "Look at their faces again. They're not afraid of her, they trust. Even in 1915, they somehow understood that she was trying to save them. As Margaret packed up her materials, she thought about the legacy of the 12 children. They had grown up to become teachers, doctors, parents, and grandparents. Their descendants now numbered in the hundreds, all of them living lives that might never existed without Eleanor Hardwell's intervention. The photograph would remain at the Historical Society, but its mystery was finally solved. It wasn't a record of a crime, but a testament to the power of one person's determination to make a difference in the lives of vulnerable children. Eleanor Hardwell had spent 50 years believing she had failed, never knowing that her courage had created a legacy that would span generations. Join our mission to preserve and share important historical stories. Your support helps us uncover hidden truths and honor the courage of people like Eleanor Hardwell, who risked everything to help others. Together, we can ensure that no story of heroism is lost to time. The photograph of Eleanor and Dora Hardwell and the 12 children now hangs in the Boston Historical Society, accompanied by a plaque that reads, "In memory of Eleanor and Hardwell, 1885, and the 12 children she saved." Their story reminds us that sometimes the greatest acts of courage are hidden from history, known only to those whose lives were forever changed by one person's determination to do what was right. Margaret Chen's investigation not only solved a century-old mystery, but also led to the establishment of the Hardwell Foundation, which continues Eleanor's work by supporting organizations that protect vulnerable children around the world. The foundation's motto, taken from the faint inscription on the back of the original photograph, reads simply, "The truth lies in the eyes of the innocent."